Picture yourself as a supporter of a team that had not won a major trophy in 56 years. A club that once drew 68,000 people through the gates on a Tuesday night, not for a final, not for a title decider, just for a league match. A club with a support base so enormous, so loyal, so relentlessly hopeful that the waiting itself had become part of the identity. That was Newcastle United. That was what they carried into November 2021 when the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund completed its takeover and Eddie Howe arrived in the Northeast with a club sitting 19th in the Premier League, pointless in their last 14 games, and staring directly at the championship. What followed across the next 4 years is not simply a story about a football club improving, it's a story about the reconstruction of an entire institution, about a manager who arrived in crisis and did not just solve it, but transcended it entirely, and the scale of what Howe achieved step by step with clarity and conviction deserves to be understood properly. To grasp why the Howe era means what it means, you have to start where he started. He watched his first match in charge from a hotel room isolating with COVID-19 as Newcastle drew 3-3 with Brentford on the 20th of November 2021. He'd inherited a squad that Steve Bruce had been unable to lift, a dressing room low on confidence, and a club that had not won any of its first 14 Premier League games that season. The record was historic, and not in the way anyone wanted. No club in Premier League history had gone 14 games without a win and survived. The statistics alone made the case for relegation look overwhelming, and yet Howe did not behave like a manager managing decline. He worked on the training ground with a precision that the players noticed almost immediately, introducing concepts of shape, of pressing triggers, of collective responsibility that gave structure to what had felt like drift. The results shifted. Newcastle won 12 of their final 18 games. They finished 11th. On the 20th of April 2022, a 1-0 win over Crystal Palace made Newcastle the first team in Premier League history to survive after failing to win any of their opening 14 matches. What Howe had accomplished in those first months was extraordinary precisely because it operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The immediate task was survival, a championship or bust scenario where a single bad run could have dragged the club into the second tier, but Howe was already thinking beyond escape velocity. He was building a defensive shape that could be sustained, a pressing system that the players understood, a way of playing that would remain coherent even when the fixtures came thick and fast. The quality of opposition mattered less than the consistency of execution. Against Manchester City, Newcastle did not attempt to outsource their opponents. They sat deep, they pressed triggers carefully, they looked to transition quickly into moments where they held numerical advantage. Against Fulham, they dominated possession and territory, pushing higher up the pitch to suffocate space. The tactical flexibility was not improvisation, it was evidence of a manager who had a clear blueprint and the intelligence to adapt its application depending on its circumstances. The conversations in the training ground reflected this philosophy. Howe spoke to his players about principles rather than rigid instructions, about the why behind the what, ensuring that when situations changed on the pitch, they understood how to respond without needing guidance from the touchline. That survival transcended what final standings could capture. It was proof of concept. It was the first signal that Howe was genuinely capable of something extraordinary. The progression from that survival into European competition was rapid in a way that no reasonable projection had anticipated. By May 2023, just 18 months after Howe had joined a club in freefall, Newcastle finished 4th in the Premier League. Champions League football returned to St. James's Park for the first time since the 2002-2003 season. 9,113 days between European nights of that magnitude. That number alone captures the scale of the wait. The recruitment during this period was a critical part of the story. Bruno Guimaraes, signed from Lyon in January 2022, became one of the finest midfielders in English football over the course of the following 2 years. His influence extended beyond statistics. He was a presence in the dressing room, a player who understood what winning demanded, someone who had competed at the highest levels and carried that experience into every training session. Sven Botman arrived from Lille in 2022 and immediately brought composure and aerial authority to a backline that had been leaking goals. His distribution from deep was instrumental in Newcastle's ability to transition from defense to attack with efficiency. Lewis Hall came in from Chelsea and developed into one of the more dependable left backs in the division. Each signing reflected a specific, coherent philosophy. Players who were relatively young, capable of pressing with intensity, and compatible with the tactical framework Howe had built. His preferred structure and possession, a 4-3-3 that collapsed into a 4-5-1 out of the ball, demanded a particular type of player, one willing to press opposition defenders high and transition quickly. The recruitment team, operating under sporting director Dan Ashworth, became increasingly effective at identifying targets that could execute this blueprint. They looked for players with specific attributes: left-footedness in certain positions, aggressive pressing instincts, the ability to receive the ball in tight spaces and find a pass. This specifically meant that when injuries struck or circumstances changed, the replacement signings could slot into the system with minimal disruption. The 2023 to 2024 season brought injuries on a scale that would have derailed most squads. Howe was forced to adapt his shape repeatedly, moving between a 3-4-2-1 and a flat 4-4-2 at different points across the campaign. Alexander Isak, the club's primary striker, missed substantial periods. Bruno Gomes operated below his best level due to various fitness concerns. And even so, Newcastle still produced their highest scoring Premier League season on record, netting 85 goals across 38 games. That kind of attacking output under those circumstances spoke to something deeper than tactics. It spoke to a culture that Howe had installed inside the club, an expectation of intensity and ambition that persisted even when the squad was stretched almost to its limit. The second-string players understood what was required. When Callum Wilson was unavailable, players shifted into attacking positions and produced goals. When defensive injuries mounted, academy players received opportunities and rose to the challenge. The club had moved from crisis management to normality. That was the fundamental shift. Newcastle were no longer fighting to survive, they were competing to win. And then came the 16th of March 2025, Wembley Stadium, the EFL Cup final. Newcastle United against Liverpool. Goals from Dan Burn and Alexander Isak. A 2-1 victory, a trophy, the first major honor for Newcastle United in 56 years. The path to that final had included a 4-0 aggregate win over Arsenal across two legs in the semi-final, a tie that brought Newcastle their first victory at the Emirates Stadium since 2010. These were not minor details, they were statements about how far the club had traveled under Howe's management. The significance of that trophy cannot be measured in points or positions. Howe became the first English manager to win a major domestic honor since Harry Redknapp lifted the FA Cup for Portsmouth in 2008, and the first to win the League Cup since Steve McLaren did it for Middlesbrough back in 2004. For the supporters at Wembley, for the people who had watched 56 years pass without a trophy, the final whistle brought moments of profound emotion. Grown men and women overwhelmed in the stands, players collapsing into each other on the pitch, their minds struggling to comprehend what they had achieved. The realization came in waves. The decades of disappointment, the near misses, the false dawns, all of it crystallized into a single moment of release. Children who had been born after the previous trophy, grandparents who had feared they might never see this day, all of them finally witnessing the end of an agonizing drought. 6 weeks after that final, Howe guided Newcastle to a fourth-place finish and Champions League qualification for the second time. The trophy had not come at the cost of league form. Both things existed simultaneously, and that was perhaps the clearest evidence of how robust the project had become. What followed in the summer of 2025 tested that robustness in ways that even the previous crisis had not. Alexander Isak, who had scored 23 goals in 32 Premier League appearances the season before, left for Liverpool in a transfer worth £125 million, a British record. The sale was not what Howe or the club wanted. Isak had been the cornerstone of everything Newcastle built in the final third: the movement, the clinical finishing, the physical presence that created space for Gomes and those around him. The loss created a vacuum that extended beyond statistics. It meant rethinking how Newcastle attacked, how they pressed, how they structured their transitions. No Newcastle player managed to reach double figures in Premier League goals during the 2025 to 2026 campaign. Nick Woltmade signed from Stuttgart as one of the several replacements and scored 7 goals in his first 14 appearances before going 14 games without a league goal. The difficulty in replacing a striker of that caliber was not a failure of planning, it was simply the reality of losing the most productive attacker in the club's Premier League history to a club that could offer European pedigree Newcastle had not yet fully accumulated. Newcastle dropped 25 points from winning positions across the 2025 to 2026 Premier League season, the most of any side in the division, a dramatic contrast to the 7 they dropped the previous year, the fewest in the league. The transition was painful and visible. Results came inconsistently. There were nights when the attacking patterns looked fragmented, when the clinical edge that had defined Newcastle seemed to have disappeared entirely, and yet, on the 26th of April 2026, Howe secured Champions League qualification again. For the third time in 4 seasons, Newcastle would play in Europe's elite competition. The fact that he delivered that result while rebuilding around the loss of his most important attacking player while navigating PSR constraints that he himself described as giving the club limited room to maneuver speaks to the depth of what he had built at St. James's Park. Howe had spent over £700 million in transfer fees since the takeover began. He brought in 26 players across that period, but the decisions were coherent. The project had a direction, and the club that had spent years defined by dysfunction and near relegation was now a fixture in the Champions League, a trophy winner for the first time in more than half a century, and a club rebuilt from the foundations up by a manager who understood exactly the work required.